The obsidian floor of the Grand Synod of the Valkosh hegemony was polished to such a degree of molecular perfection that it did not merely reflect the vaulted ceiling above, but seemed to swallow the light of the nebula-infused chandeliers, creating the illusion that the High Council sat suspended over an infinite, starless void. The air in the chamber was cold, recycled through filtration systems that had been humming without pause for 4,000 years, carrying the scent of ozone, polished chitin, and the subtle, pheromonal undercurrent of supreme authority. At the center of this immense hall, which was large enough to house the atmospheric skimmers of lesser civilizations, knelt a single figure, small and trembling against the scale of the architecture. Xylas, a scout envoy from the peripheral client species known as the Authari, pressed his forehead against the black glass of the floor, his breathing ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had traveled across the breadth of the spiral arm, burning out the drive cores of 3 courier vessels, violating isolation protocols, and bypassing the lower courts of the bureaucracy just to be here in this moment, to deliver a message that he knew, with a terrifying certainty, would be ignored. Above him, arranged in a semicircle on floating dais made of anti-gravitic basalt, sat the high exarchs of the hegemony, their towering, armored forms draped in the crimson and gold synth silks of their station. They were the Valkosh, the apex predators of the galaxy, a species that had not known defeat since they first crawled from the primordial oceans of their homeworld 10 millennia ago. They were conquerors, architects of a stellar empire that spanned systems too numerous to name without the aid of a datacore, and they looked down upon Xylas not with malice, but with a crushing, indifferent boredom. High Exarch Malvath, the eldest of the council, leaned forward, the servos in his ceremonial power armor whining at the edge of hearing, a sound that vibrated in Xylas's teeth. Malvath's face was a landscape of scars and hardened dermal plates, his eyes 4 points of burning amber light that drilled into the back of the messenger's head. When he spoke, his voice was a deep tremor that resonated through the floor, a sound that was felt as much as heard, carrying the weight of absolute command. He asked why a servant of the Outer Rim, a creature of such negligible standing, had dared to interrupt the War Council during the planning of the Great Reclaiming. The Exarch's tone suggested that the answer had better justify the interruption, or the price would be the immediate and painful liquidation of Xylas's entire lineage. Xylas swallowed, his throat dry, his mandibles clicking softly in a spasm of fear. He raised his head, forcing himself to look up at the towering figures of the hegemony, his eyes watering from the sheer pressure of their collective gaze. He spoke of the Sol system. He spoke of the blue jewel that the hegemony's stellar cartographers had designated as Target 88 Beta. He spoke of the humans, and then, with a voice that threatened to crack under the strain of his terror, he delivered the warning that had haunted his sleep for cycles. He told them that Earth was not a target. He told them it was a trap, not a trap of hidden fleets or orbital cannons, for the Authari scouts had seen none, but a trap of existence, a snare laid into the fabric of the sector itself. He begged them to reconsider. He told them that the silence radiating from that system was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a held breath before a scream. The reaction of the High Council was not anger, but a ripple of low, chittering amusement that spread through the chamber like dry leaves scraping over stone. General Calith, the supreme commander of the hegemony's armada, stood from his dais, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the messenger. Calith was a giant even among his kind, a warrior poet whose strategies had glassed worlds and enslaved species. He laughed, a harsh, metallic barking sound. He gestured to the holographic star chart that shimmered in the air between them, a sprawling web of conquered territory that glowed with the virulent green of the Valkosh. He pointed to the tiny, isolated speck of the Sol system, a lonely star on the edge of the Orion Arm, far from the trade routes, far from the centers of galactic civilization. He asked Xylas if he truly believed that this primitive species, these soft-skinned bipeds who had barely mastered the rudiments of hyperlane travel, posed a threat to the combined might of the hegemony. He mocked the humans' history, their fragmented nations, their reliance on combustion and fission long after the rest of the galaxy had moved to zero-point energy. He called them children playing with fire in a straw house. Calith's voice rose, filled with the arrogant pride of a commander who has gotten the taste of fear. He declared that the scouts had seen no fleets because there were no fleets to see. He declared that the humans were hiding, cowering in the dark, hoping the universe would not notice them. And he declared that the Valkosh would bring them the light of the hegemony, whether they wished for it or not. Xylas tried to speak again to explain that the lack of fleets was the very thing that should terrify them. He tried to explain the data his people had recovered from the edge of the Uit cloud, anomalous readings, shifts in the quantum foam, whispers of a technology that didn't just manipulate energy but curated probability. But Malvath raised a hand, silencing him. The gesture was final. The Exarch spoke of destiny. He spoke of the hegemony's need for the resource-rich planets of the Sol system to fuel the expansion into the next quadrant. He dismissed the warning as the superstition of a lesser race, a primitive fear of the unknown that the Valkash had long ago evolved beyond. He ordered Xylas to be removed from the chamber, not executed, but detained, so that he might watch the conquest from a viewing cell, to learn that the Valkash feared nothing in the void. As guards in sleek black armor dragged the screaming messenger away, the High Council returned to their star charts, their laughter fading into the serious, murmured business of genocide. They moved icons of fleets, vast formations of dreadnoughts and carriers, tracing lines of vector and velocity toward the yellow sun. They discussed logistics, supply lines, and the eventual assimilation of the human population into the slave caste. They were efficient, brilliant, and utterly blind. They did not notice that the holographic projection of the Sol system flickered slightly, a microscopic distortion in the light, as if the star itself was watching them back. The mobilization of the hegemony's armada was a sight of terrifying majesty, a display of industrial and military might that turned the dark skies above the shipyard world of Ethelgard into a tapestry of fire and steel. Thousands of vessels, ranging from the needle-like corvettes to the moon-sized super-dreadnoughts, broke orbit in synchronized formation, their engines painting the void with trails of blue iron fire. The flagship Worldbreaker was a leviathan of war, a cathedral of destruction kilometers long, its hull adorned with the melted trophies of 1,000 conquered civilizations. Inside the bridge of the Worldbreaker, General Calith stood before the grand viewport, watching the stars stretch and blur as the fleet prepared for the jump into the sublayer. The mood on the bridge was one of professional anticipation. The crew, elite officers of the Valkash, moved with the precision of clockwork, their clawed fingers dancing over haptic interfaces, their voices calm and clipped as they reported readiness across the fleet. There was no fear here. Why would there be? They were the hammer of the gods. They were the inevitability of history. The concept of defeat was a linguistic obsolescence, a word that applied only to others. As the countdown to the jump began, the navigation officer, a female Valkash named Vora, paused. Her 4 eyes narrowed as she scrutinized the readout on her console. For a microsecond, the navigation computer had thrown an error, a buffer overflow suggesting that the destination coordinates did not exist, or rather that they existed in a state of flux that the computer could not reconcile. She ran a diagnostic, but the system returned to green immediately. She hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty in a life of rigid discipline. She looked up at the general's back, considering whether to report the glitch. But the countdown was already at single digits. To abort the jump of a fleet this size for a sensor ghost would be a career-ending humiliation. She convinced herself it was a calibration error, a phantom echo from the fleet's own massive energy signature. She engaged the drive. The universe twisted. The familiar nausea of sublayer transit washed over them, a sensation of being stretched thin across infinite distance, before the reality bubble snapped back into place. They were traveling faster than light, tearing through the skin of the galaxy toward the trap that had been set for them before their species had even discovered fire. The journey to the Sol system took 3 standard weeks, a time the fleet spent in war games and simulations. In every simulation, the humans were crushed within hours. Their projectile weapons were deflected by shields. Their primitive nuclear missiles were intercepted by point defense lasers. Their communications were jammed, their infrastructure dismantled. The Valkash officers laughed at the crude designs of the human ships they had on file, blocky utilitarian things that looked more like industrial refineries than warships. They lacked the elegance of the hegemony's aesthetic, the organic flow of Val. Kosh engineering. The officers joked about which human city they would claim for their personal estates. They debated the merits of human labor versus robotic automation. They were drunk on their own supremacy, intoxicated by the certainty of their worldview. But as they drew closer to the boundary of human space, the mood began to shift. It wasn't a sudden change, but a slow, creeping erosion of confidence that started in the lower decks and worked its way up. It began with the dreams. Engineering crews reported waking up in cold sweats, describing nightmares of a white room, perfectly silent, where a figure sat in a chair and watched them without blinking. The figure wasn't threatening. It was simply present, radiating a sense of profound, unbearable patience. Then came the technical anomalies. The long-range sensors, usually capable of reading the thermal signature of a corvette across a sector, began to report a gray out. They weren't malfunctioning. They were simply receiving no data. No background radiation, no cosmic dust impacts, nothing. It was as if the space ahead of them had been scrubbed clean, sterilized of all information. General Calith dismissed the reports as interference from the complex magnetic fields of the local nebula, but he found himself pacing the bridge more frequently, his claws clicking rhythmically on the deck. He ordered active scanning pulses, massive bursts of energy that should have lit up the Sol system like a flare. The pulses went out, but they didn't come back. There were no echoes. The silence that Xylas had warned them about was beginning to manifest, and it was heavier than the armor of the world breaker. When the fleet finally breached the Uit cloud and reverted to real space at the edge of the Sol system, the silence transitioned from a sensor reading to a physical wait. The viewports opened to reveal nothing. There were no defense platforms guarding the outer planets. There were no patrol squadrons. There were no navigation buoys. The planets hung in the dark, silent and majestic, spinning in their orbits with the indifference of celestial mechanics. Neptune and Uranus were cold, blue sentinels offering no resistance. The fleet moved inward, passing the orbit of Saturn. The glorious rings of the gas giant were breathtaking, but the scanners showed no mining outposts, no habitats. It was pristine. This unnerved the tactical officers. A civilization capable of spaceflight should have colonized its own system. They should be stripping the asteroids for metals, harvesting the gas giants for fuel. The lack of industrial footprint suggested one of two things. Either the humans were far more primitive than believed, or they had moved beyond the need for crude extraction. The latter possibility was one that Calith refused to entertain. "They are hiding," Calith announced to the bridge crew, his voice booming to fill the uncomfortable quiet. "They have retreated to their cradle world, hoping we will pass them by. We will not." He ordered the fleet to adopt an assault formation, a claw of the void arrangement designed to envelop a planet and bombard it from all angles. They pushed inward past Jupiter, past the asteroid belt. Still nothing. The tension on the bridge was palpable now. It was too easy. It was like walking into a tomb. The weapons officers' hands hovered over their firing controls, their eyes darting between the empty tactical displays and the visual feeds. They wanted a target. They needed a target. The lack of an enemy was more stressful than combat. In combat, there is action and reaction. Here, there was only the reflection of their own aggression staring back at them from the void. And then, as they approached the orbit of Mars, it happened. The entire fleet, thousands of ships, simultaneously lost power to their main drive clusters. It wasn't a mechanical failure. The fusion cores were still active, the plasma was still hot, but the thrust simply ceased to result in motion. The laws of physics governing propulsion seemed to have been locally suspended. Inertia dampened. The fleet drifted to a halt, suspended in the vacuum. Alarms blared, then were silenced by confused officers. "Report," Calith roared, gripping the railing of the command deck, his knuckles white. "Sabotage, ambush." "No, Exarch," Vora whispered, her voice trembling. "Physics, the constants, they are changing. The fine structure constant in this sector is shifting. Energy is no longer translating to kinetic force in the same ratio." Before Calith could process this insanity, a signal broke through the comms. It didn't come on a specific frequency, it came on all of them. It came through the audio speakers, the holographic emitters, even the bone conduction implants of the crew. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It was a request. "Please hold your position," a voice said. It was calm, genderless, sounding less like a biological entity and more like the smooth texture O. F. Polished stone. "Diplomatic protocols are now in effect. We apologize for the abrupt halt. We find that kinetic energy is often a barrier to conversation." A single ship appeared. It didn't warp in. It simply faded into existence directly in front of the world breaker. It was tiny compared to the dreadnought, a geometric shape that hurt the eyes to look at, a tesseract unfolding and refolding upon itself, comprised of a material that shifted between matte white and the black of a singularity. It had no engines, no weapons ports, no windows. It was an object of pure mathematics. Calith stared at it, his heart's pounding. This was the trap. "Open fire," he screamed. "Destroy it, all batteries, full barrage." The gunnery crews, drilled by decades of conditioning, obeyed. The world breaker and its escort vessels unleashed a torrent of destruction that could have cracked a tectonic plate. Plasma torpedoes, Antimatter beams, railgun slugs the size of buildings, all converged on the tiny, shifting shape. And then they stopped. The projectiles, the beams, the plasma, everything froze a few kilometers from the human vessel. They hung in space, suspended in a field of amber light, trapped in a moment of time. The energy didn't dissipate, it just sat there, a frozen explosion. "We really would prefer you didn't do that," the voice said again, sounding slightly disappointed, like a teacher correcting a slow student. "It creates such a mess of the local causal manifolds. Please allow us to come aboard. We need to talk about your surrender." "My surrender?" Calith sputtered, his mind reeling. "I am High Exarch Calith of the Valkash. I have burned 100 worlds. I do not surrender to a geometry puzzle." "Not your surrender," the voice corrected gently. "Your salvation. You are standing on a pressure plate, General. We are trying to keep you from stepping off." A shimmer of light appeared on the bridge of the world breaker, ignoring the particle shields, the blast doors, and the internal security grids. A figure materialized. It was a human. He was of average height, wearing a simple gray tunic that looked like woven fabric but behaved like liquid armor. He had no weapons. He looked tired, with lines around his eyes and gray at his temples. He held a datapad in one hand and a cup of something steaming in the other. He looked around the bridge, at the towering alien warriors in their power armor, at the panic on their faces, and he took a sip from his cup. "I am Ambassador Vance," the human said. "Welcome to the Sol Exclusion Zone. I'm afraid you've made a terrible mistake coming here, but we're going to try to fix it before you hurt yourselves." Calith drew his sidearm, a heavy plasma caster, and leveled it at the human's chest. "You are a sorcerer," Calith snarled. "You manipulate the void with tricks, but plasma burns human. Even your tricks cannot stop heat." Vance looked at the gun, then up at Calith's eyes. There was no fear in the human's gaze, only a deep, profound pity. "General, the weapon in your hand operates on the principle of excitement of ionized gas. To work, it requires the strong nuclear force to bind the atoms in the chamber. In this room, currently, I decide if the strong nuclear force applies. If you pull that trigger, the gas will simply drift apart. You will look foolish." Calith hesitated. The utter certainty in the human's voice was more terrifying than any threat. He lowered the weapon slightly. "What are you?" he whispered. "The scouts said you were primitives, combustion engines, radio waves." "We were," Vance said, walking over to the tactical display. He tapped the surface and the image of the Valkash fleet changed. Instead of ships, the display showed complex equations, webs of energy and intent. "We were primitives, and then about 500 years ago we found something, or rather we realized something. We realized that technology based on exploding things, expanding gases, splitting atoms was a dead end. It's loud, it's messy, it's childish." He looked up at the aliens. "We went inward. We studied consciousness. We studied the observer effect in quantum mechanics. We learned that the universe isn't made of matter, General. It's made of information, and if you know the language, you can edit the script." The bridge was silent. The aliens exchanged glances. This was heresy. This was madness. "We don't use ships to travel," Vance continued, gesturing to the view of the frozen fleet. "We edit our location coordinates. We don't use weapons. We edit the hostility of the environment. You see, you haven't invaded a star system. You've walked into a high-density information processing unit. The Sol system is a computer, and we are the system administrators." "Then why hide?" Calith asked, his voice gaining a shred of its former strength. "If you are gods, why hide in the dark? Why let us believe you were weak?" "Because we aren't gods," Vance said softly. "We are gardeners and because of what we guard." Vance tapped the console again. The holographic display zoomed out past the solar system, past the local cluster, to the edge of the galaxy. "You call us a trap, you're right, but we aren't the jaws, we're the safety latch." He turned to face the entire bridge crew. "The Valkash have been expanding for thousands of years. You conquer, you consume, you move on. You are a fire. Fires are natural, but you were about to burn something that must not be touched." "What?" Calith asked. "The breach," Vance said. The word seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "There is a flaw in this sector of reality, an old wound in the spacetime beneath Earth. It's where the laws of physics are thin. If a species with sufficient aggression and sufficient mass, like your fleet, brings enough kinetic energy and hatred into this specific gravity well, the wound opens. And what comes through isn't an enemy you can fight. It is the end of meaning. It is pure entropy. We stay here quiet and small to keep the noise down, to keep the sleeping thing asleep." Calith stared at the human. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to call it a lie. But he looked out the viewport at his frozen fleet. He looked at the projectiles hanging in mid-void. He looked at the impossible geometry of the human ship. The logic held. The humans had mastery over reality, yet they stayed on one planet. Only a duty of infinite importance could compel such restraint. So, Vance said, clapping his hands together, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet bridge. Here is the situation. Your fleet is currently armed and primed with enough megatons of yield to crack the crust of reality. If I release the stasis field and those weapons hit my ship, the feedback loop will wake the breach. We all die. The galaxy unravels. It's a bad Tuesday for everyone. What is your demand? Caleth asked, feeling the weight of his armor dragging him down. You want us to leave, to retreat in shame? No, Vance said. It's too late for that. You've already brought the aggression here. The energy is already in the system. We can't just send you back. The wake of your warp drive would tear the scar open. You are stuck here, General. You and your millions of soldiers. Stuck, Caleth stepped forward. For how long? Vance smiled, a sad, tired smile. Until you change. Change. The breach feeds on intent, on aggression, on the desire to conquer. As long as you are the Valkosh hegemony, as long as you are conquerors, you cannot leave this system. The physics of the exclusion zone won't let you. You are quarantined. You would imprison us, Caleth roared. We will starve, we will. You won't starve, Vance interrupted. We have unlimited energy. We have food replicators that make your finest banquets look like gruel. We will provide for you. We will give you everything you need, except a way out, not until you learn to be something else. The realization hit Caleth like a physical blow. It wasn't a prison of bars. It was a prison of paradise. They were to be held in a state of enforced peace, stripped of their purpose, their war, their identity, until they evolved. This is monstrous, Caleth whispered, to rewrite a culture. It is better than extinction, Vance said. We have done it before. The Athari, they were once like you. They spent 300 years in the exclusion zone. Now they are poets and scouts. They warned you, didn't they? They tried to save you from the timeout corner. Vance reached out and touched the holographic display. The frozen projectiles outside the ship began to dissolve, turning into harmless drifts of colorful gas. The weapons systems on the Valkosh ships powered down, their codes rewritten in an instant by the human AI. Welcome to Earth, General, Vance said. School is in session. It's going to be a long semester. The months that followed were a surreal nightmare for the Valkosh, a dismantling of their psyche that was more painful than any physical torture. The fleet was moved into stable orbits around the gas giants. The soldiers were offloaded onto orbital habitats constructed by the humans in mere days, structures of crystal and light that floated in the upper atmosphere of Jupiter. The habitats were beautiful, terrifyingly so. There were gardens, libraries, arenas for sport non-lethal only, and vast halls for debate. The humans did not rule them. They did not patrol the hallways with guns. They simply managed. If a Valkosh soldier tried to build a weapon, the parts would simply refuse to fit together or the material would soften into putty. If a fight broke out, the gravity in that specific room would shift, gently pinning the combatants to the ceiling until they cooled off. It was a tyranny of benevolence. Caleth spent his days in a high-spire observation deck, overlooking the swirling storms of Jupiter. He watched his warriors. At first, they raged. They screamed at the walls, they clawed at the W. Endows, but the humans just watched, patient and unyielding. They sent counselors not to argue but to listen. They sent artists. They sent teachers. Slowly, the breakdown occurred. A dreadnought captain, a veteran of the Siege of Rilo, began to paint. At first, he painted scenes of slaughter, vibrant with red and black. But over time, the red turned to orange, the black to blue. He began to paint the storms of Jupiter. He found a strange peace in the turbulence of the clouds. A squad of shock troopers, bred for close-quarters combat, discovered the archives of human philosophy. They read Nietzsche, Sun Tzu, Marcus Aurelius. They found parallels to their own codes of honor, but with a twist, the idea that the greatest victory is the one that requires no battle. They began to debate, awkwardly at first, then with passion. They formed a philosophical circle, arguing the merits of Stoicism versus their own warrior code. Caleth resisted the longest. He held onto his hate like a shield. He demanded audiences with Vance, who came every week to drink tea and talk. You are erasing us, Caleth accused during one such meeting. My people are warriors. If we are not warriors, we are nothing. You are not erasing, Vance replied, pouring a cup of tea for the giant alien. You are molting. A crab is soft when it sheds its shell, general. It feels vulnerable. But it is the only way to grow. You have reached the limit of what conquest can give you. You have filled your maps. Now you must map the inside. And what if we refuse? What if we choose to sit here and rot for 1,000 years? Then we will wait, Vance said. We are very good at waiting, but look at your men, Calith. Look at them. Are they rotting, or are they waking up? Calith looked down at the habitat below. He saw young Valkosh playing a human game, chess, with old soldiers. He saw a choir of his people singing, their multitonal voices creating a harmony that vibrated the crystal walls. He saw something he had never seen in a military encampment: creativity. The turning point came a year into the quarantine. A signal was detected from the deep dark, not from the hegemony, but from the breach. The wound that Vance had spoken of. It was a pulse of such profound wrongness that every sentient being in the system felt it, a sudden wave of cold, nausea, and despair. The humans reacted instantly. The geometric ships swarmed the point of instability near Earth, but the pulse was strong. The trap was being tested from the other side. Vance appeared on Calith's monitor, looking for the first time truly afraid. The feedback from your arrival, it weakened the seal more than we thought. Something is pushing through. We need help. Help, Calith stood up. You are the gods of physics. What can we do? We are the architects, Vance said. We can hold the wall, but we cannot fight what comes through the cracks. The entities, they are psychic constructs, manifestations of pure aggression. They are immune to our edits because they don't follow the laws of our universe, but they are vulnerable to will, to disciplined, focused martial intent. Calith felt a spark in his chest that he hadn't felt since the day he left Ethelgard. You need warriors. We need the Valkosh, Vance admitted. But not the Valkosh who came here to conquer. We need the Valkosh who have learned why they fight. We need defenders. Calith walked to the window. He looked at his fleet drifting dark and silent in the void. He keyed the comms. This is High Exarch Calith. All units, attention. His voice boomed through the habitats. The painting captains, the debating shock troopers, the gardening gunners, they all stopped. The humans have been holding the door shut, Calith said. But something is knocking. They have given us a choice. We can remain prisoners of peace, or we can become the guardians of this reality. We came here to conquer Earth. Instead, we will save it. He paused. Reactivate the weapon systems, but disable the targeting safeties. We do not fire on coordinates today. We fire on the dark. The humans released the locks. The Valkosh fleet powered up, but it wasn't the same fleet. The ships were painted with new symbols, symbols of unity, of balance. The engines roared to life, not with the hungry growl of conquest, but with the steady hum of duty. The breach opened near the orbit of Venus. It wasn't a portal, it was a tear in the eye of the beholder. Shadows poured out, writhing, screaming things that were not made of matter but of hate. They washed over the human containment ships, dampening their reality-bending fields. Engage, Calith ordered. The Valkosh fleet unleashed hell, but this time the fire was precise. The soldiers, honed by a year of introspection, fought with a clarity they had never possessed. They didn't fight for loot or territory. They fought for the beauty of the system that had imprisoned them. They fought for the chess games, the paintings. The silence. The shadows recoiled. They could not withstand the focused will of the Valkosh. The plasma burned them, the lasers cut them, but it was the intent behind the shots that drove them back. The Valkosh were not feeding the breach with mindless aggression. They were cauterizing it with righteous defense. It took 3 hours. The combined might of the human gardeners and the Valkosh guardians sealed the rift. As the last shadow shrieked and vanished, silence returned to the Sol system. Calith slumped in his command chair. He was exhausted, but he felt lighter than he ever had. Vance appeared on the bridge. He wasn't a hologram this time. He had shuttled over. He walked up to Calith and extended a hand. You can leave now, Vance said. The quarantine is lifted. The physics of your engines will work again. You can go home. Calith looked at the human hand, small and soft compared to his armored claw. He took it gently. Home, Calith mused. He looked at the star chart, at the sprawling green empire of the hegemony. It looked small, it looked petty. We cannot go back, Calith said. Not as we were. If we return, we will be seen as failures. Or worse, we will fall back into the old ways. The hegemony is a machine that only knows how to eat. Then what will you do? Calith looked at the Earth, the blue marble that had defeated an empire without firing a shot. We have been the sword for 10,000 years, Calith said. Perhaps it is time to be the shield. You watch the door, Vance. We will patrol the yard. There are other rifts, other threats to the fabric. Many, Vance nodded. The galaxy is old and fraying. Then the Valkosh have a new mission, Calith declared. We are the high guard of Saul. We are the trap's teeth. Let the galaxy know the hegemony is dead. The alliance of the shield is born. And so the warning of Xylas the messenger came true, though not in the way he feared. The Valkosh did not return. The Empire waited for its fleet, but no ships came back. Instead, rumors began to spread. Rumors of a new power in the Orion Arm, a power where human logic and Valkosh strength were woven together. A power that did not conquer but protected. In the Grand Synod on the homeworld, the remaining exarchs sat in their cold, dark hall, waiting for a fleet that had found something more valuable than victory: purpose. They stared at the empty star charts, and for the first time in 10 millennia, the Valkosh felt true fear. Not of the humans, but of the silence that had swallowed their greatest warriors and breathed them out as heroes. The trap had sprung, and the galaxy would never be the same. The age of empires was over. The age of the gardeners and their guardians had begun. The silence of the synod was broken only by the shivering of the messenger Xylas, who had been kept alive to witness the triumph. He looked at the exarchs, and for the first time he did not bow. He stood up, he smiled, and he walked out of the chamber, leaving the masters of the universe alone in the dark.